What do you do when the man who changed fashion forever can no longer keep up with the world he built? Yves Saint Laurent wasn't just a designer. He was a cultural force, the prodigy who redefined women's wardrobes, the fragile genius crowned at Dior, the man whose initials came to symbolize liberation, elegance, and power. But behind the legend was a much darker story, one that unfolded slowly, quietly, and long before anyone dared to say it out loud. Because the truth is this: Yves didn't have one downfall. He had many. A scandal that shook Paris, addictions that hollowed him out, a house that grew bigger than its creator, and finally a legacy rewritten by people who outlived him. So how does the most influential designer of the 20th century lose control of his art, his body, and his own name? Because today we see the brand everywhere, but how many of us really know the price he paid to build it? Before Yves Saint Laurent became the most influential designer of the 20th century, he was just a quiet boy in Oran, Algeria, trying to make sense of a world that never felt built for him. He escaped into sketches, magazines, and elaborate paper doll couture shows, tiny rehearsals for a future he seemed almost predetermined to reach. Paris wasn't just a dream. It was the only place where the intensity of his imagination could make sense. That intensity became obvious the moment he entered the International Wool Secretariat competition at 17. He won, and a year later, he was already working at Dior. Within months, Christian Dior, the most powerful name in fashion, decided that this shy teenager, trembling behind thick glasses, should one day succeed him. When Dior passed away suddenly in 1957, Yves was 21 and responsible for saving French couture. His first collection was a sensation. Editors cried. Buyers applauded. The fashion establishment, which had doubted him at first sight, now treated him like a phenomenon who had arrived fully formed. But behind that triumphant debut was a designer carrying far more than talent. Yves had already lived through the trauma of the Algerian conflict, struggled with anxiety since adolescence, and shaped his entire identity around the need to please, to be perfect, to be brilliant, to live up to expectations he never set for himself. Genius became both his gift and his burden. It didn't take long for the cracks to show. 2 years after Dior's death, the same house that had celebrated him pushed him aside. When Yves was drafted into military service, Dior used the moment to replace him, triggering a psychological collapse that left him hospitalized and unable to work. The experience scarred him deeply, reinforcing a fear that would follow him for the rest of his life. That success could be taken away as quickly as it was given. Pierre Berger stepped in at this moment, partner, strategist, protector, and together they built the house of Yves Saint Laurent. From the start, their dynamic was unmistakable. Yves created the fantasy. Berger built the structure that allowed it to exist. And for a time, the formula worked. The 1960s and early 1970s became a period of dazzling, creative clarity. Le smoking gave women the power to dress like men in the most exclusive rooms. The Mondrian dress turned art into wearable geometry. The safari jacket brought military practicality into high fashion. The Rive Gauche ready-to-wear line made his vision accessible beyond couture salons. He wasn't following trends. He was inventing the visual language that everyone else would spend decades copying. Few designers have ever reshaped fashion with that level of force and consistency. But even in these years of brilliance, the pressure was tightening. Each success raised the stakes for the next. The work grew heavier, the expectations sharper, and the dependency on Berger more absolute. Yves was at the height of his power, but already living inside a system that demanded more from him than any one person could sustain. The fall hadn't begun yet, but its foundations were already in place. By the early 1970s, Yves Saint Laurent had achieved something rare. He wasn't just shaping fashion, he was defining the direction of modern culture. Women trusted him, critics praised him, and the house felt unstoppable. But the truth is that by the time the world crowned him its genius, Yves was already struggling to keep pace with the mythology forming around him. The pressure to innovate every season, to remain the designer who always saw the future first, was becoming impossible to sustain. And then came the moment that exposed just how fragile that pedestal was. In 1971, Yves unveiled the collection now known simply as Scandal. Inspired by the silhouettes of the 1940s, the era of occupation, scarcity, and quiet rebellion. He sent out platform shoes, fur stoles, padded shoulders, glossy makeup, and unapologetically sensual silhouettes. To Yves, it was historical memory reframed as modern glamour. To critics, it was unacceptable. Overnight, the press accused him of glorifying wartime collaboration, trivializing suffering, and dragging couture into the gutter. Headlines called the collection hideous, vulgar, and a farce. For a designer who had once brought editors to tears, the reversal was severe. What the industry didn't realize at the time was that the collection was less a miscalculation and more a symptom, a sign that Yves was operating from a place of exhaustion, instability, and a growing distance from the world he was expected to lead. Ironically, the same critics who condemned it would later call it prophetic, crediting it with igniting the retro trend that dominated the rest of the century. But the damage was done. Something in Yves had shifted. This is also the moment when nightlife, substances, and escapism stopped being accessories to his fame and quietly became coping mechanisms. The parties grew louder, the circle around him tighter, and the dependence on alcohol and tranquilizers more visible. Le smoking, the tuxedo suit that let women dress like men in the most powerful rooms, had made him a feminist icon. But the man behind that revolution was unraveling. Inside the house, the dynamic with Pierre Berger grew even more complicated. Berger kept the business running, kept Yves protected, kept the legend intact. But he could not keep pace with the designer's spiraling anxiety. As the 1970s progressed, the rituals of creation became heavier, the deadlines sharper, the aftermath more draining. Yves was still producing important work, but the gap between the public triumph and the private toll was widening. The Scandal collection wasn't the fall, but it made one thing clear. Yves could shock the world brilliantly, but he could also shock it in ways that revealed how unstable his world had become. The industry moved on quickly, however, Yves did not. By the early 1980s, Yves Saint Laurent was still celebrated as a legend, but the edge that had once made him untouchable was slipping. The industry was changing, younger designers were entering the conversation, and Yves was trapped in a pattern that had become painfully familiar. A burst of brilliance, followed by exhaustion, followed by the heavy silence of recovery. What the public saw as elegance and discipline often hit a man increasingly unable to shoulder the demands of his own legacy. The work began to repeat itself. Reviewers who once praised his instinct now pointed out how often he returned to earlier ideas. Another safari reference, another tailored jacket, another version of Le Smoking. It wasn't laziness. It was survival. Yves was designing through sedation, through insomnia, through a dependence on substances just to steady himself long enough to get through a season. The routine that had once fueled innovation was now draining him. The breaking point came in the late 1980s, as the fashion industry shifted and his collections grew increasingly elaborate and expensive. The gap between his creative vision and commercial reality widened. The 1987 stock market crash made luxury couture feel tone-deaf to the moment. Reviews grew harsher. Yves, overwhelmed and physically depleted, had to hand the ready-to-wear line over to his assistants. For a designer whose entire identity was bound to the work, it was a public admission that he no longer had control. Meanwhile, the business around him was showing its own signs of fatigue. Ready-to-wear was expanding, licensing deals multiplied, and the company was mired in debt by the early 1990s. It wasn't just a creative slowdown, it was a structural one. The house relied heavily on its past successes, while the finances crumbled beneath the surface. Behind closed doors, his world was shrinking. Yves retreated into a tightly protected routine between Paris and Marrakesh, surrounded by a circle of confidants who alternated between enabling and shielding him. Pierre Berger tried to manage the fallout, but even he could not hold back the growing sense that the man who once defined modern fashion was disappearing behind the machinery of his own brand. The eventual sale of the company in 1993 to Elf Sanofi for $650 million made the decline official. Yves and Berger walked away wealthy, but the emotional cost was obvious. The house that had carried his name was no longer his to steer, and the designer himself was becoming more myth than presence. Rumors about his health circulated constantly. Every runway appearance raised the same quiet question: would he make it to the end of the catwalk? By the mid-1990s, Yves Saint Laurent was still producing collections, still beloved, still referenced. But the original fire was gone, and everyone knew it. The genius had not disappeared, but it was now operating inside a body and a business that could no longer keep up. The story didn't pause when Yves stepped back. In many ways, it became even more complicated. His final years at the house were marked by exhaustion and fragility, and when he retired in 2002, the world mourned the end of an era. But inside the industry, the real question wasn't about his past. It was about what would happen to a brand whose identity was built on a man who could no longer lead it. Almost immediately, a quiet battle began over how Yves should be remembered. Pierre Berger positioned himself as the guardian of the legacy, approving projects that aligned with his vision of Yves as a fragile genius and blocking anything that didn't fit the mythology. When the documentary Celebration offered a raw, unflattering look at the designer's decline, Berger fought to suppress it. To him, the truth was less important than the portrait Yves deserved, one of dignity, brilliance, and tragedy. But the mere existence of the film revealed something deeper: a tension between the man Yves was and the version of him the world preferred to believe in. Meanwhile, the brand had to continue without him. Creative directors came and went, each trying to reconcile heritage with modern relevance. And then, in 2012, Hedi Slimane arrived, not to preserve the past, but to completely redirect it. His most controversial decision was the one that still defines today's identity: removing Yves from the ready-to-wear line and renaming it Saint Laurent Paris. Fans saw it as erasure. Critics called it sacrilegious, but commercially, the shift marked the beginning of a new era. The YSL of memory became the Saint Laurent of modern culture: sharp, dark, cinematic, and unmistakably Slimane. When Anthony Vaccarello took over in 2016, he didn't try to imitate Yves either. Instead, he amplified the house's sensuality, its nightlife energy, its high-gloss confidence. Under him, Saint Laurent became a brand associated with music stages, global celebrities, and an aesthetic that feels more rock concert than couture salon. For a generation that never experienced Yves's couture years, this is the only Saint Laurent they know: powerful, glamorous, instantly recognizable. The logo became shorthand for a lifestyle rather than a designer. Culturally, this is where the disconnect becomes unmistakable. Yves' work empowered women through tailoring, androgyny, intellectual elegance. Today's Saint Laurent sells an attitude built around silhouette, seduction, and stage presence. Both are valid. Both are successful. But they live on opposite ends of the fashion spectrum. What remains is a brand thriving on a momentum its founder never saw, built for a world he would not have recognized. The irony is that Yves himself has become a kind of myth: honored, referenced, beloved, but distant. His name appears in retrospectives, museum exhibitions, and fashion textbooks. But the commercial reality of the brand that carries his initials is now shaped by values completely separate from the fragile genius who defined Parisian fashion for 40 years. The man and the machine no longer share the same heartbeat. So, what does modern fashion truly remember? The brilliance? The scandals? The decline? Or simply the logo on a leather bag in a store window? Curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and as always, see you in the next one.